Charles learned all this news at Naples, and, tired of his late conquests, which necessitated a labour in organization for which he was quite unfitted, turned his eyes towards France, where victorious fetes and rejoicings were awaiting the victor's return. So he yielded at the first breath of his advisers, and retraced his road to his kingdom, threatened, as was said, by the Germans on the north and the Spaniards on the south. Consequently he appointed Gilbert de Montpensier, of the House of Bourbon, viceroy, d'Aubigny, of the Scotch Stuart family, lieutenant in Calabria, Etienne de Vez, commander at Gaeta, and Don Giuliano, Gabriel de Montfaucon, Guillaume de Villeneuve, George de Lilly, the bailiff of Vitry, and Graziano Guerra, respectively, governors of Sant' Angelo, Manfredonia, Trani, Catanzaro, Aquila, and Solmon, then leaving behind in evidence of his claims the half of his Swiss, a party of his Gascons, 800 French lances, and about 500 Italian men-at-arms, the last under the command of the prefect of Rome, Prospero and Fabrizio Colonna, and Antonio Savelli. He left Naples on the 20th of May at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, to traverse the whole of the Italian peninsula with the rest of his army, consisting of 800 French lances, 200 gentlemen of his guard, 100 Italian men-at-arms, 3,000 Swiss infantry, 1,000 French, and 1,000 Gascons. He also expected to be joined by Camillo Vitelli and his brothers in Tuscany, who were to contribute 250 men-at-arms. A week before he left Naples, Charles had sent to Rome Monseigneur de St. Paul, brother of Cardinal de Luxembourg, and just as he was starting he dispatched thither the new Archbishop of Lyons. They both were commissioned to assure Alexander that the King of France had the most sincere desire and the very best intention of remaining his friend. In truth, Charles wished for nothing so much as to separate the Pope from the League, so as to secure him as a spiritual and temporal support. But a young king, full of fire, ambition, and courage, was not the neighbour to suit Alexander, so the latter would listen to nothing, and as the troops he had demanded from the Doge and Ludovico Sforza had not been sent in sufficient number for the defence of Rome, he was content with provisioning the castle of Sant' Angelo, putting in a formidable garrison, and leaving Cardinal Sant' Anastasio to receive Charles while he himself withdrew with Caesar to Orvieto. Charles only stayed in Rome 3 days, utterly depressed because the Pope had refused to receive him in spite of his entreaties, and in these 3 days, instead of listening to Giuliano Delta Rovere, who was advising him once more to call a council and depose the Pope, he rather hoped to bring the Pope round to his side by the virtuous act of restoring the citadels of Terracina and Civita Vecchia to the authorities of the Romagna, only keeping for himself Ostia, which he had promised Giuliano to give back to him. At last, when the 3 days had elapsed, he left Rome and resumed his march in 3 columns towards Tuscany, crossed the States of the Church, and on the 13th reached Siena, where he was joined by Philippe de Comines, who had gone as ambassador extraordinary to the Venetian Republic, and now announced that the enemy had 40,000 men under arms and were preparing for battle. This news produced no other effect on the king and the gentlemen of his army than to excite their amusement beyond measure, for their enemy by their easy conquest, that they could not believe that any army, however numerous, would venture to oppose their passage. Charles, however, was forced to give way in the face of facts, when he heard at San Terranza that his vanguard, commanded by Maréchal de Guy, and composed of 600 lancers and 1,500 Swiss, when it arrived at Fornova had come face to face with the Confederates, who had encamped at Girolles. The Maréchal had ordered an instant halt, and he too had pitched his tents, utilizing for his defence the natural advantages of the hilly ground. When these first measures had been taken, he sent out, first, a herald to the enemy's camp to ask from Francesco di Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, generalissimo of the Confederate troops, a passage for his king's army, and provisions at a reasonable price; and secondly, he dispatched a courier to Charles VIII, pressing him to hurry on his march with the artillery and rearguard. The Confederates had given an evasive answer, for they were pondering whether they ought to jeopardize the whole Italian force in a single combat, and putting all to the hazard, attempt to annihilate the King of France and his army together, so overwhelming the conqueror in the ruins of his ambition. The messenger found Charles busy superintending the passage of the last of his cannon over the mountains of Pontremoli. This was no easy matter, seeing that there was no sort of track, and the guns had to be lifted up and lowered by main force, and each piece needed the arms of as many as 200 men. At last, when all the artillery had arrived without accident on the other side of the Apennines, Charles started in hot haste for Fornovo, where he arrived with all his following on the morning of the next day. From the top of the mountain where the Maréchal de Guy had pitched his tents, the king beheld both his own camp and the enemy's. Both were on the right bank of the Taro, and were at either end of a semicircular chain of hills resembling an amphitheatre, and the space between the two camps, a vast basin during the winter floods by the torrent which now only marked its boundary, was nothing but a plain covered with gravel, where all manoeuvres must be equally difficult for horse and infantry. Besides, on the western slope of the hills there was a little wood which extended from the enemy's army to the French, and was in the possession of the stratiotes, who, by help of its cover, had already engaged in several skirmishes with the French troops during the 2 days of halt while they were waiting for the king. The situation was not reassuring. From the top of the mountain which overlooked Fornovo, one could get a view, as we said before, of the two camps, and could easily calculate the numerical difference between them. The French army, weakened by the establishment of garrisons in the various towns and fortresses they had won in Italy, were scarcely 8,000 strong, while the combined forces of Milan and Venice exceeded a total of 35,000. So Charles decided to try once more the methods of conciliation, and sent Comines, who, as we know, had joined him in Tuscany, to the Venetian provveditori, whose acquaintance he had made when on his embassy, he having made a great impression on these men, thanks to a general high opinion of his merits. He was commissioned to tell the enemy's generals, in the name of the King of France, that his master only desired to continue his road without doing or receiving any harm, and therefore he asked to be allowed a free passage across the fair plains of Lombardy, which he could see from the heights where he now stood, stretching as far as the eye could reach, away to the foot of the Alps. Comines found the Confederate army deep in discussion, the wish of the Milanese and Venetian party being to let the king go by, and not attack him. They said they were only too happy that he should leave Italy in this way, without causing further harm, but the ambassadors of Spain and Germany took quite another view. As their masters had no troops in the army, and as all the money they had promised was already paid, they must be the gainer in either case from a battle, whichever way it went; for if they won the day they would gather the fruits of victory, and if they lost they would experience nothing of the evils of defeat. This want of unanimity was the reason why the answer to Comines was deferred until the following day, and why it was settled that on the next day he should hold another conference with the plenipotentiary to be appointed in the course of that night. The place of this conference was to be between the two armies. The king passed the night in great uneasiness. All day the weather had threatened to turn to rain, and we have already said how rapidly the Taro could swell. The river, fordable to-day, might from tomorrow onwards prove an insurmountable obstacle, and possibly the delay had only been asked for with a view to putting the French army in a worse position. As a fact, the night had scarcely come when a terrible storm arose, and so long as darkness lasted, great rumblings were heard in the Apennines, and the sky was brilliant with lightning. At break of day, however, it seemed to be getting a little calmer, though the Taro, only a streamlet the day before, had become a torrent by this time, and was rapidly rising. So at 6 in the morning, the king, ready and armed on horseback, summoned Comines and bade him make his way to the rendezvous that the Venetian provveditori had assigned. But scarcely had he contrived to give the order when loud cries were heard coming from the extreme right of the French army. The stratiotes, under cover of the wood stretching between the two camps, had surprised an outpost, and first cutting the soldiers' throats, were carrying off their heads in their usual way at the saddle-bow. A detachment of cavalry was sent in pursuit, but, like wild animals, they had retreated to their lair in the woods, and there disappeared. This unexpected engagement, in all probability arranged beforehand by the Spanish and German envoys, produced on the whole army the effect of a spark applied to a train of gunpowder. Comines and the Venetian provveditori each tried in vain to arrest the combat on either side. Light troops, eager for a skirmish, and, in the usual fashion of those days, prompted only by that personal courage which led them on to danger, had already come to blows, rushing down into the plain as though it were an amphitheatre where they might make a fine display of arms. For a moment the young king, drawn on by example, was on the point of forgetting the responsibility of a general in his zeal as a soldier; but this first impulse was checked by Maréchal de Guise, Messire Claude de la Châtre de Guise and M. de la Tremaille, who persuaded Charles to adopt the wiser plan, and to cross the Tower without seeking a battle, at the same time without trying to avoid it, should the enemy cross the river from their camp and attempt to block his passage. The king accordingly, following the advice of his wisest and bravest captains, thus arranged his divisions. The first comprised the van and a body of troops whose duty it was to support them. The van consisted of 350 men at arms, the best and bravest of the army, under the command of Maréchal de Guise and Jacques Prévost. The corps following them consisted of 3,000 Swiss, under the command of Engelbert de Clèves and de Launay, the queen's grand equerry. Next came 300 archers of the guard, whom the king had sent to help the cavalry by fighting in the spaces between them. The second division, commanded by the king in person and forming the middle of the army, was composed of the artillery, under Jean de la Grange, 100 gentlemen of the guard, with Gilles Caron for standard bearer, pensioners of the king's household under Aymar de Prie, some Scots, and 200 crossbowmen on horseback, with French archers besides, led by M. de Cruseau. Lastly, the third division, i.e. the rear, preceded by 6,000 beasts of burden bearing the baggage, was composed of only 300 men at arms, commanded by de Guise and by de la Tremouille. This was the weakest part of the army. When this arrangement was settled, Charles ordered the van to cross the river, just at the little town of Fourneveau. This was done at once, the riders getting wet up to their knees, and the footmen holding to the horses' tails. As soon as he saw the last soldiers of his first division on the opposite bank, he started himself to follow the same road and cross at the same ford, giving orders to de Guise and de la Tremouille to regulate the march of the rear guard by that of the centre, just as he had regulated their march by that of the van. His orders were punctually carried out, and about 10 o'clock in the morning the whole French army was on the left bank of the Taro. At the same time, when it seemed certain from the enemy's arrangement that battle was imminent, the baggage, led by the captain, Odet de Reberac, was separated from the rear guard, and retired to the extreme left. Now, Francisco de Gonzaga, general in chief of the confederate troops, had modelled his plans on those of the king of France. By his orders, Count de Cajazzo, with 400 men at arms and 2,000 infantry, had crossed the Tower where the Venetian camp lay, and was to attack the French van, while Gonzaga himself, following the right bank as far as Fornovo, would go over the river by the same ford that Charles had used, with a view to attacking his rear. Lastly, he had placed the Stradiotes between these two fords, with orders to cross the river in their turn, so soon as they saw the French army attacked both in van and in the rear, and to fall upon its flank. Not content with offensive measures, Gonzaga had also made provision for retreat by leaving 3 reserve corps on the right bank, one to guard the camp under the instruction of the Venetian provveditori, and the other 2 arranged in echelon to support each other, the first commanded by Antonio de Montefeltro, the second by Annibale Bentivoglio. Charles had observed all these arrangements, and had recognized the cunning Italian strategy which made his opponents the finest generals in the world; but as there was no means of avoiding the danger, he had decided to take a sideway course, and had given orders to continue the march. But in a minute the French army was caught between Count de Cajazzo, barring the way with his 400 men at arms and his 2,000 infantry, and Gonzaga in pursuit of the rear, as we said before, leading 600 men at arms, the flower of his army, a squadron of Stradiotes, and more than 5,000 infantry. This division alone was stronger than the whole of the French army.